Hello, my name is Christopher Paris. I'm with a consulting company called Oxbridge Quality Resources. We provide quality management consulting for ISO certifications and accreditations. We've also run for the last 15, 20 years or so a whistleblower program within that area and have gathered a tremendous amount of data related to fraud and conflicts of interest within this ISO certification and accreditation scheme. What I want to talk about today is whether or not those conflicts of interest rise to the level of either being illegal under civil law or criminal law in most countries, or perhaps both civil and criminal. I also want to emphasize that I do understand that if I make these claims without evidence and proof, that is defamation per se, which in US law is a special higher level of defamation that would allow any victim to automatically get damages. And so there's a tremendous amount of pressure on me to make sure that the facts are straight. And I will tell you this, the facts are supported by an extreme amount of documentary evidence, whether through the whistleblower program, third-party reporting, news reports, journalists, official government reports, etc. Everything I'm about to say is heavily documented. And because I'm very familiar with defamation, having won one of the largest civil judgments against somebody who was defaming me and won multiple other cases, I take this very seriously, that I know that I can't make these claims without having evidence to support them, and I do. Again, the short answer is to the question is whether or not this certification, these conflicts of interest, rise to the level of being either civilly in violation of civil law or criminal acts, and the answer to both is yes, and I'm going to explain that. This video is going to be a little bit longer than some of my others, and if you want shorter content, I'm sorry, but the reason for that is that because this is such a serious issue, I wanted to take more time to unpack it and be very careful about it. But also my hope is that this video sits and percolates over time, and that it will eventually draw the attention of the people who can actually do something about this. And that would mean legislators, regulators, journalists, and law enforcement. That at some point they may see this and begin to piece together just the level of severity and the international span of this problem, and how many events have happened that are all connected through this single tissue of certification and accreditation. And if that system worked, how so many of the things that we've seen happen would not have happened. And I'll go into detail on those in a minute. But the intent is that this is an important video, and I want to go into a medium level of detail with the hope of attracting the people who can then fix the problem. Let me begin by extremely briefly discussing what do I mean by ISO certification and accreditation for anybody who might not fully understand what I'm talking about and why it's important. And also keep in mind that much of what I'm talking about is a type of fraud that goes on in other industries around the world, and not just this related to ISO certification. That just happens to be the industry that I'm an expert in. So this is the one I'm going to talk about, but there's a lot of the same kind of thing happening around the world elsewhere. With regard to ISO certification and accreditation, let me be clear that those words have different meanings: certification and accreditation. Typically, certification is a certificate that's granted to either a person or a company. The accreditation is the recognition given to the body issuing the certification. I'm not going to make a big distinction for this video. It's relevant if you're involved in the profession, and if this were to go to court and that sort of thing, we could get into the differences. But for this video, we're going to use the terms interchangeably, which it'll drive experts crazy, but understand, I know the difference. It's just not going to be super relevant to, I believe, the audience of this video. All right, we're going to use the terms interchangeably. Effectively, what happens with these certifications is that companies, private companies, perhaps nonprofit organizations, public companies, etc., they want to obtain these certifications to prove the quality of the product or service that they're providing. And many, many years ago, decades ago, when these didn't exist, you would buy products and services and you might not know ahead of time the quality, whether they're good or bad. The intent of these certifications and accreditations was to provide consumers, regulators, governments, etc., with a signal ahead of time that this company could be trusted to either manufacture a high quality product or provide a service. For the purposes of this video, I'm going to focus on two main types of companies, although these certifications could apply to anybody. One is manufacturers. These could be manufacturers of cars, airplanes, rockets, medical devices, pacemakers, pharmaceuticals, drugs, medical products, plastics, babies' toys, materials that go into buildings, etc. So manufacturers of any type whatsoever, they might pursue one of these ISO certifications to prove they have a quality system in place that would ensure the quality of the products and services that they produce. There's no guarantee, by the way, but it gives an assurance that they have the system in place that should ensure quality. And the second type of business is the laboratories, specifically test laboratories. These are test laboratories that do testing on, for example, DNA testing for forensics to determine paternity, to determine whether a crime was committed by a certain person or not, which might lead to either somebody going to jail or someone being released from jail, right? So DNA testing, medical product testing. For example, cannabis, medical cannabis testing to ensure that the cannabis is a high quality. If you're going to be using this for medicinal purposes, that you would not be using a corrupted product of some sort, but all sorts of other drugs and pharmaceuticals. So very important things here. We're talking about manufacturing and test laboratories specifically, even though there's a wide array of other companies that might pursue these. But this gives us a little bit of focus on why this is so important. So if the quality of those products and tests are important, we need to be sure that any attestation that arises from a certificate or an accreditation can be trusted, that we can trust that a company that is producing a defective product or a fraudulent test result is not at the same time somehow certified and accredited, telling the world that, hey, you can trust us because we have the certificate. And that's essentially why this is so important. Now, the other critical aspect of this is once one of these companies holds a certificate of some sort, they then gain access to both federal or whatever country you're in, government contracts, as well as contracts from large manufacturers such as maybe, or large organizations like Boeing or Lockheed or NASA or General Motors or the Department of Defense, the Air Force, these kind of things. In many cases, there is a contractual flow down saying, in order for you to even bid on a contract or a bid on a job, you must have this certificate in place ahead of time. For the test labs, it's often in order to perform work for a state government or a national government, you have to have this accreditation that proves that your testing is reliable and trustworthy before you can even perform those tests for perhaps, again, a government or maybe a law enforcement agency, et cetera. So it's extremely crucial that we can trust these accreditations and certifications. And what we're going to reveal now is that we've lost that trust and just show about how severe this is and the danger that it causes to the public and to human health. Now, very quickly, I'm going to talk about how this works if you're a company wanting to pursue this and the shape of this scheme, which is shaped like a pyramid. For example, if I'm a manufacturer or a test laboratory and I want one of these certifications or accreditations because for whatever reason, I want to gain contracts, I want to beat my competitors, whatever. I want to project to the world that you can trust me that I'm making a quality product or providing a quality service. I would go out and buy a standard. A standard is just a book. It's a document. They're usually a few dozen pages long, etc. And they're typically published by ISO, but they may be published by any other organization. I'm specifically concerned with the ISO ones. So they go out and they buy an ISO standard, they spend a few $100s. They then implement the rules that are defined in that standard. When they're comfortable that they're ready to go, they then hire an auditing body. And again, that could be a certification body or it could be an accreditation body. For now, we're just going to use the term auditing body to reflect whoever they might hire. The auditing body is then tasked with coming in and performing an audit to verify that the company does comply with that standard. They're supposed to be identifying gaps where the company does not comply, but also they are tasked with identifying where there may be potential fraud. This is crucial because the entire certification and accreditation scheme was invented specifically to stop companies from attesting that they had a quality product or service when they didn't. and they were making false claims. Today, both certification bodies and accreditation bodies claim they're not in the business of identifying fraud, and that is untrue. That is literally their job. Their job is to go in and verify if the company says it complies with the ISO standard, are they lying or not? And you do that by gathering evidence. So the auditors will go in and conduct an audit gathering objective evidence through either verbal testimony, written documentation, records, what they physically see with their eyes, doing inspections and other things like that. It is supposed to be a rigorous process, but they gather evidence, and at the end of the audit, which could be either a few days to, even if it's a large company, could be many weeks of auditing, they gather evidence up and they come up with a result. The result is going to be you either pass or fail. You might get nonconformities. You might pass with nonconformities, and you just have to close the nonconformities, and then you're issued your certificate. In extreme cases, you should fail. If the company clearly doesn't comply, the certification body or the accreditation body is not supposed to issue a certificate. Now, in order to make all of that valid, there are bodies above them, okay? A certification body will typically certify a manufacturing company, but then above them is an accreditation body, and this is where the difference applies. The accreditation body is supposed to ensure that the certification body itself is not engaged in fraud and is performing its audits honestly, gathering objective evidence, making its decision impartially, etc. In the laboratory space, we skipped the CB level entirely, and the laboratory itself, because they're issuing certificates, test results, they get accredited, and that's the slight difference. I don't want to get into too much detail on that. But you have certification bodies with accreditation bodies above them. All of them are subject to specific standards that govern their own rules. And they're also subject, in some cases, to international law, which I'll talk about in a moment. If you have problems, but there exists the possibility that the accreditation bodies that appear to be at the top, they themselves will be engaged in some kind of fraud. And we have controls over them as well. And that has to do with a scheme which we call the IAF, the International Accreditation Forum. I'm going to continue to use that name. They just underwent rebranding this year in 2026 they're calling themselves the Global ACI, the Global Accreditation Cooperation Incorporated. It's complicated. Everyone knows them as the IAF. The IAF sits above them, and they're the ones that are supposed to manage whether or not the accreditation bodies and certification bodies are engaged in fraud or not. So there is a pyramid here that we see, with the company pursuing certification at the bottom and the IAF all the way at the top. And this is where we find all the conflicts of interest and where we're going to identify whether or not these bodies are violating the law or not. Now let's just briefly talk about what do I mean by a conflict of interest. When these auditing bodies, and again, whether it's a certification body or an accreditation body, when the auditing bodies go in, they're obligated to ensure that they perform their audits objectively and impartially. This is to ensure that when they issue that final certificate that's attesting to the quality system or the quality of the product or the quality of the test, etc., that we can trust that certificate. If they're engaged in fraud, if they're not being impartial, if they're just accepting bribes under the table, etc., we can't trust those certificates anymore. So the entire basis of this scheme relies completely on trust, and trust means there are no conflicts of interest. What specifically are the conflicts of interest that are prohibited? There are lots of them, but the biggest one is simply that the certification body or the accreditation body cannot also consult. They cannot perform consulting because that would be a conflict of interest. If they consulted for a company and then came in and audited, they're auditing their own work. If they did a poor job consulting, would they really find themselves as a nonconformance? Well, no, they would just rubber stamp themselves and say, we did a great job consulting, and so here's a certificate. Now, if you understand the accounting world, for example, the accounting world understands this, and it is illegal. You cannot be an accountant or a financial auditor cannot be the same person or company that did the company's books, that did the bookkeeping. It has to be a different person. This is the same rule here, except it's in a different way. The auditing body cannot also be the consultant who prepared the system that is undergoing audit. This obviously makes sense. Now, for many, many years, this was understood and enforced. And in the early years, in the 90s and early 2000s, it was enforced pretty heavily to the point that entire companies that were found to have been engaging in this conflict of interest were broken up. And I'll give you two great examples. One very famous one was Perry Johnson. Perry Johnson was a businessman. He's also now a politician, but he operated a auditing body that also did consulting. And it was in the early days before they had really firmed up the rules and everything. But people decided that this was a violation because he could go into a company, issue nonconformities that were then conveniently resolved if you took his consulting. Or he might sell the consulting and then just go in, and the argument would be that the Perry Johnson company would just rubber stamp their own consulting work. There was no evidence that was happening, by the way. That was just an argument. It was the appearance of some kind of conflict of interest. The world took that so seriously, they forced Perry Johnson to break it up. He had to divest the auditing company. The auditing company became Perry Johnson Registrars. It still has his name on it, but he's not involved in it anymore. He sold it. He has nothing to do with it. All right. And he led Perry Johnson Consulting. And now the two companies are completely different companies, and they forced him to split this up. That's how seriously they took it. I'll give you another example. In the United States, the main accreditation body is called ANAB, the ANSI National Accreditation Board. ANAB literally exists now because it was broken up when it was engaged in these conflicts of interest. Years ago, it was called RAB, the Registrar Accreditation Board. And RAB was selling both consulting and credentialing alongside accreditation. And there was an argument made that when they came into a company and if they wrote nonconformities against the qualifications of the people in the company, well, it was very convenient. They could just go buy classes from RAB and credentials from RAB and to resolve those nonconformities. So there was a financial conflict of interest. The world took that so seriously that they broke them up. RAB divested and sold its consulting and credentialing programs to Australia. And that company became called RAB QSA, which now is known as Exemplar Global. And the accreditation body was rebranded as ANAB, the ANSI National Accreditation Board. So ANAB exists right now because of this breakup. So this was very serious in those days. Now, what we've seen, however, in the last 10 years, but really ramping up in the last 5 years, is that these rules are no longer enforced. And let me pause for a minute and tell you where those rules are housed. When I say rules, what are those rules? Essentially, we have two forms of rules that would discuss and govern and mandate these prohibitions against conflict of interest. The first are the voluntary ones, which are additional ISO standards. So for certification bodies, they need to comply with something called ISO 17021. You don't need to remember any of this. For accreditation bodies, they need to comply with something called 17011. For test laboratories, they need to comply with either 17025, 17020. There's a host of them. Each one of those standards includes language prohibiting these conflicts of interest, okay? Prohibiting consulting, certifying your own work, crediting your own work, that sort of thing. They're prohibited. In addition, in some countries and throughout all of Europe, there is an actual European law that governs this and directs this. And let me see what that's, I've forgotten now what that law is. But that applies to Europe and the UK, and that is EC 765/2008 is the European regulation. That is an actual law, EU law that governs and says that these kind of conflicts of interest are illegal. Now, the UK folks may say, well, they went through Brexit. However, as a part of Brexit, the UK decided not to separate itself from that EU law. So despite the fact that this is an EU law, it is still applicable in the UK despite Brexit. So we have, in case of all of Europe, including Great Britain or United Kingdom, we have an actual law in the books that says that these conflicts of interest are illegal, and it is supposed to be then enforced accordingly. So again, we have standards and we have actual laws in some countries. There may be similar laws in other countries. China has laws like that. Maybe Japan does, etc. But that's where this is codified. This is where it is documented and defined. I'm not making these things up. These conflicts of interest are prohibited very strictly by multiple documents, including actual laws. What happened sometime around 5 years ago to maybe 10 years ago, it was a slow process. It's like the story of the frog in the frying pan, right? It was slow, but it definitely ramped up within the last 5 years, is that those rules and laws are no longer enforced. They're still on the books. All of the bodies still market themselves according to it. They insist we comply with all these, but they go entirely unenforced. And we've seen case after case after case, and especially in the last 5 years, where it's been a series of dominoes falling, where the bodies have obliterated the rules. ANAB, for example, is transitioning from becoming primarily an accreditation body back to becoming a training and credentialing body. Everything that they did, they're throwing into the dustbin of history, and now they're going back to doing what they're doing. We're watching, you can see they're a nonprofit, so we have insight into their tax returns, but you see the revenue that is that they gain from training and credentialing is now increasing. And it's probably on track to maybe in about 10 years or so, they'll be earning more in that. There's a lot more money to be had in training than there is in accreditation. So they will not really be primarily an accreditation body anymore. Now remember, they owe their existence to the fact that they were divested, they were broken up because of this, and now they've ramped up and just started doing the thing that they were broken up for previously. But now there's no one stopping them, and there's no one divesting them, and they're getting away with it. That's just one example. Another example, I'm looking here, ANAB formed a partnership with a consulting company called IdeaGen. IdeaGen, like idea generation. We filed a complaint against that, and ANAB just closed the complaint on itself and said, we're not in violation, right? And they threw it out. That relationship seems to be maturing. So now they have a relationship with a specific consulting company, which is a violation of their accreditation rules, and in the UK and Europe against the law. But they're doing it anyway. And if you file a complaint, they resolve it themselves and they just throw it out. Another large accreditation body in the United States is A2LA. They do a lot of test labs and other things. And A2LA opened up its training and consulting company called A2LA Workplace Training. And they just operate. It's literally in the name. Their name is in there. They tried to argue that it's separate companies, but we found actual press releases where they admitted it wasn't. It was an A2LA company. The certification bodies have done the same thing. Last year, or I think it was last year, a famous one called LRQA, which used to be called Lloyd's Registered QA. LRQA just bought my #1 competitor in the aerospace consulting scheme, which is Core Solutions. If you go to the Core Solutions website, it now says Core Solutions and LRQA Company. So a manufacturer can hire Core, which is an LRQA company, to do the consulting, and then LRQA will come in and do the audit and certify its own work. The argument, we filed complaints, but LRQA simply ignored them, which is another violation, by the way. They are not answering the complaint, but presumably, I guess they're going to say they're separate companies, but they're not, because legally they all answer eventually to a single CEO. We found the same thing with Intertek. Intertek has a series of training and consulting companies. They argued that it was a separate company. They're all separate, but they're not, because they all answer to the same executive, and all of the services are marketed together. You can get the consulting and the certification under what they call their TIC program. It's all marketed the same by the same company under the same CEO. We saw similar arrangements with UKAS, the UK Accreditation Service. Another accreditation body in the United States, IAS, the International Accreditation Service, was selling consulting services via template kits. You could buy a template kit to implement the standard that they would then audit. So they came in and they would audit documents that their own board members were selling. We filed complaints on that and nothing was done. Bureau Veritas, another large certification body, recently just bought a consulting company and is now certifying its own consulting company's work. Quality Austria, very large international certification body, was caught repeatedly running multiple consulting companies under its own name and then certifying its own work. When we reported that, the accreditation body over them refused to investigate and we found out a host of scandals there involving some criminal activity. We took that to the Austrian courts, but the Austrian courts wouldn't push it because the accreditation body is actually part of the Austrian government, and they didn't want to investigate. But we see now that nearly every major accreditation body and certification body is engaged in open consulting, selling of consulting services, or owning a consulting company, and then certifying the clients of that company. And almost all the smaller CBs are now also doing it because there is no longer any oversight. The accreditation bodies do not write up the certification bodies for these violations. If you file a complaint, and even if you take it all the way up to the top level at the IAF has stopped enforcing the rules. However, they're going around the world insisting that they do, and they have hoodwinked entire governments. Governments believe this, so they give contracts to ANAB. ANAB holds multiple Defense Department and other federal contracts. UKAS has the sole authority as the United Kingdom's sole accreditation body. Many others throughout the world have these contracts where they have no competition because they've attested to their governments that they comply with these rules that they don't. They actually do not comply with. So why is this bad? Why are these conflicts of interest bad then? We can look to see at a couple exact examples of why this is bad in the real world. And I think a great place to start is the Grenfell Tower fire. This happened in the UK. Dozens of people were killed in a residential tower building when it was found out later that the building materials used were supposed to be fireproof and were not. And yet the testing laboratories involved, which were all accredited by UKAS, the UK's accreditation service, their sole accreditation body, the laboratories had falsely attested that these products were fireproof when they were not. The UK did a big investigation, but people died because of this. And they found out at the end that UKAS had not been following its own procedures and was culpable in this. This is the official inquiry now. Found that UKAS was culpable. Nothing happened, however. The government would not pull the trigger and do anything about it, even though they found the accreditation body was culpable. But people died as a result of that. I'll come back to the culpability thing in a minute. But people died. Another great example is the Boeing 737 crashes, which killed hundreds of people. Hundreds of people died. And there was a great discussion over what this MCAS software, which was used to control defective angle of attack indicators. Essentially, the angle of attack indicators on the plane were defective, so Boeing created this software that would compensate, but the software itself was bad and was overriding the controls of the pilot. The pilot was trying to pull the plane up, and the software is pushing the nose down and, rammed the things into the ocean or into a mountain, etc., and killed a bunch of people. If we go to the root cause, however, the root cause was the defective angle of attack indicators. And those manufacturers all had certifications, quality certifications. When it was not only known that the angle of attack indicators were defective, they actually wrote software to compensate for it. But no one had ever done anything about it, and they held fully accredited quality certifications, and as a result, hundreds of people died. I'll give you a few more examples, and this is just from my files here. Long time ago, this is 2010 or so, I spoke to an actual auditor who was with BSI, a very large UK-based certification body. He physically audited the Deepwater Horizon rig and wrote problems up. That was being run by BP Oil out of Houston, Texas. They held a certification to ISO 9001, which was issued by BSI and accredited by ANAB. The auditor wrote up problems, and BSI buried them because they wanted BP's business. And then we know what happened with Deepwater Horizon. The rig exploded, killed a dozen workers or so, and caused the greatest man-made environmental disaster in human history. We had a similar case of that with another company called Hercules Offshore, a similar blowout protector disaster, similar to Deepwater Horizon. I don't know if anybody died in that particular case. Let's see. The Department of Defense performed ISO audits on some companies, including Pratt Whitney, SpaceX, United Launch Alliance, and Aerojet Rocketdyne. and they found dozens and dozens of nonconformities. These were then reported in the press. This is a downloadable report that anybody can download from the Department of Defense, Inspector General's office. And they found dozens of nonconformities, raising concerns over human health. These are carrying people. In the case of SpaceX, they were man-rated, rockets that are going to put astronauts. At the time, they hadn't done it yet, but they were going to put astronauts in them. And nothing happened. These were then, brought to the attention of the certification bodies and the accreditation bodies, all of which were overseen by ANAB. In this case, I'm looking at my data here. All were overseen by ANAB, and nothing happened. Nothing happened. So, again, people haven't died yet, but if one of these companies ends up killing somebody, there is an evidence trail here to show that a lot of people reported problems, and the certification bodies and accreditation bodies helped cover it up. And let me do that. Let me go outside of the United States here. Just in Japan alone, we have a flood of data falsification issues, all under official ISO certifications and accreditations. We had falsified data related to aluminum products from Mitsubishi Aluminum, falsified data related to encapsulation materials from Hitachi Chemical, falsified data on pipe sealing materials and O-ring data from Mitsubishi Cable Industries, falsified roll steel data from Kubota. That's just in Japan, again, under the accreditation scheme. The Equifax data breach, which affected 148 million Americans, plus how many other millions of people around the world, they held an ISO certification for the management of their information security, their data. And yet they were hacked and affected, and nothing happened. We have one here, a Pasadena company, a plant explosion killed 22 workers. Let me go outside of the United States here again. The PIP breast implant scandal, which people in the United States probably don't know a lot about, but it really rattled Europe. They found out that this company, over the course of about 7 years, had been using industrial-grade silicone for women's breast implants instead of using medical grade. The full extent of the risk to human health on that isn't even known, because these women may have developed cancer on their own. It may have been a result of the implants, and that was certified. That company was certified by TÜV Rheinland and accredited by the German accreditation body DAKKS. But again, all under the IAF umbrella. Randox testing was another forensics lab that was found to be manipulating toxicology lab results in the UK, accredited by UKAS. Multiple forensics labs in the United States. A case that was very troublesome to me, and because we were working very hard to get something done on it, was we're back to the United States again, but a cannabis testing lab for medical cannabis was found by Nevada state regulators to be in violation and be producing fraudulent results. And for a period of many, many years, they were undergoing investigations and they were sanctioned. All during that period, ANAB was providing a laboratory accreditation to them. And we wrote to ANAB and tried to get them to stop and say this company has already been found guilty of fraud and was going to be shut down and sanctioned. It was just a matter of case of when. But ANAB continued to give them these accreditations. There was one that I was involved in, and we managed to get something done on that in the United States. But an Indian pharmaceutical company was selling eucalyptus oil, just plain old eucalyptus oil, but marketing it as a cure for COVID. And selling it not only just in India, but also throughout the world. They also held certification. We reported that. The certification body refused to take any action. They just simply wouldn't. So imagine how many people could have died if they didn't. Maybe they died taking plain old eucalyptus oil thinking it was going to cure COVID, and it didn't. We were successful in getting that taken off the market in India, but that was because we went through the US FDA. And I believe someone was actually arrested in that case, because I think that there was a US representative of that Indian company operating here, and I believe they were arrested. But you get a sense of just how, well, here's another example. There was a glove company that had been making medical gloves for doctors and patients for handling chemotherapy drugs. Those drugs are very potent, and you can't be exposed to them very much. So the nurses and doctors need to wear special gloves to handle those things. Those we found those gloves had been tested by a laboratory that was not qualified to perform the test it was claiming, and they didn't follow the procedures and the standards that they were supposed to. We reported that, and again, nothing happened with it. And that's where we get to. That's just a smattering of these. This database of mine has got something like 110 entries in it. But it gives you an example of just why this is so important, that we see real life events happening, planes crashing, forensic data falsified, counterfeit materials being installed on aircraft, defective medical products being used by surgeons and doctors, etc. This is happening all over the world, and the common thread is the ISO certification scheme, which is why it's so tremendously important. Now I want to talk about how this really works, okay, and how this is all an actual protection racket. When a company buys a certificate or an accreditation, they're paying the body above them. And this is a financial conflict of interest that is embedded in the scheme. And it is known ever since the days all of this started in the late 80s or so. It was something that was the World Trade Organization had been trying desperately to manage and then sort of fumbled. But they identified the fact that this is a problem. It's a very significant problem, a structural problem, in that the companies on the bottom are paying the company above them, and that creates a financial interest for the company on the top to not do their job. So, for example, if a company is a manufacturing company, they hire a certification body. The certification body has a financial interest to basically pass that company no matter what. If they fail them, they have one of two possibilities. One, the company might fail the audit and go out of business, in which case now the certification body doesn't have a client, so they lose money. Number two, they fail them, and the company says, fine, I will go find another certification body who's not going to fail me. And that's called certification shopping, right? We call it body shopping. And you can find another CB who's going to be easier on you. And there's plenty of those out there, okay? So it creates a scenario where a certification body cannot really do its job with integrity, objectivity, and impartiality unless it's willing to lose business. And they're simply not. Because I help set up CBs and accreditation bodies, the first thing I ask them is, do you have the stomach to say no? Can you actually fail your clients? And if you say you can't, then I'm not going to work with you. And sometimes they tell me no, we're good. Then I find out later they don't have the stomach for it anyway. But it's a very difficult thing, because you're in the business of going in and either granting a certificate or not. And also you're in the business of withdrawing that certificate. So maybe in the first year you grant the certificate, a year or 2 years later you find that company is involved in some kind of scandal. You are supposed to take that certificate away. And that means now you've lost money. You're not doing annual audits. You've lost that revenue stream. And the CBs and the ABs simply don't want to do that. So that's the first problem. But now it has evolved into something else which is even more nefarious, and that is a full-blown mafia-style protection racket. And let's break down how the mafia does their protection racket business, right? I was born in the Bronx, so I know these sorts of things. And it's not just the Italian mafia, but it's any kind of organized crime mafia syndicate around the world, right? Could be Chinese mafia, Colombia mafia, Chechen mafia, whatever. But what they do is they go around to store owners and they say, you have to pay us for protection. Now you're paying for protection from them, because if you don't pay them, they're going to bust up the store. But also, if a competing gang or mob or mafia comes in, you will get protected. So if you pay off the Italian mafia and the Colombians come in and they start muscling you, the Italians are supposed to protect you from the Colombians, and they sometimes will. And this is how you have some gang wars and that sort of thing. But that's what you're paying for. That's how the criminal version of a protection racket works. Let's see how the ISO works now. What happens is you pay your certification body. Your certification body, if they rubber stamp you, which they do, we've uncovered that they just do that. They just issue certificates to anybody and are not held accountable. But what else do you get out of that? What do you get out of that? If things go wrong, both the certification bodies and the accreditation bodies, as well as the IAF all the way at the top, will all come to your rescue. And this is where we start to now border into illegal activities. And we see this, for example, there was a case where an Italian manufacturer was found selling counterfeit product that got installed on Boeing aircraft. I think it was aluminum. Might have been titanium. I don't remember now. It was a big case and it got reported in Italy, and there were some people arrested. But the people arrested were only at the low level, you know, the worker level type of people. Nobody of significance, right? And what happened is my company began reporting this. And we went to the accreditation body, the Italian accreditation body, and they refused to investigate. So we took it up to the IAF. But the problem was the head of the Italian accreditation body was at that time also holding the chair position of the IAF. So again, he was going to investigate himself. He actually interceded directly, personally, sending me emails, arguing against any investigation. At one point, telling me wrongly that I didn't even have the right company. That he said, you're not even talking about the right company, implying it must have been some company somewhere else. He later admitted he was wrong, right? But think about that. We were trying to get counterfeit products identified in the aerospace supply chain and hold people accountable. And instead of enforcing the rules and stripping that company of its certificate, the head of the Italian accreditation body, who was also the head of the IAF, interceded on their behalf to protect them. He was later investigated too, but nothing happened. It seemed to fizzle out, you know. And I think the investigation was through journalists and it wasn't through actual criminal prosecutors. But he was directly involved, and we have the emails showing his direct involvement in the protection of this company that had falsified data and sold counterfeit product that got installed on aircraft. This is what you're really paying for. If you get into the scheme, you not only get a certificate that attests to your quality, and that might gain you some contracts and other things, but when things go wrong, the certification bodies and the accreditation bodies will run to your rescue and provide you the protection. We see this especially all the time with ANAB. If you are certified by a body that is accredited by ANAB, or if you're accredited directly by ANAB, they will provide what they call legal defensibility. In fact, they're so confident in it, they actually offer that as a marketing point in their sales. Legal defensibility against any kind of claim, which is the opposite of what they're supposed to be doing, okay? And we've seen them do this. In the case of the Nevada lab, for example, they literally allowed this Nevada cannabis testing lab to cite them over and over and over again in their defense. Now, they still lost. The company went bankrupt, and that's the only reason that they stopped operating. They eventually just went bankrupt, and they shut down. But ANAB was fighting for them up until the last minute, and this was a lab that had been found by regulators to be performing fraudulent activities regarding the testing of medical marijuana. But ANAB didn't care. ANAB has been found to do this for other forensics and DNA testing labs, but they market themselves as if you're paying into the system, they will provide legal defensibility for you. Now, what they're supposed to be doing, remember, is going in and verifying that your company conforms to the standard, and if you don't, they take away the credential. And instead, they rubber stamp the credential, and if somebody else complains, a whistleblower steps in, they will help work to block that complaint, shut it down, and even go to court on your behalf and testify for you. Now, that's only part of the protection racket, like I said. They will also, if you're not in part of the system, if you don't participate, in other words, you don't buy the certification and accreditation, they will come after you, which is another part of it. The IAF has an entire marketing program based around discrediting anybody who's not in their scheme. So now some of that is valid. There are many non-accredited, we call them certificate mills. They're like diploma mills, but they issue certificates that are completely fraudulent. And the growth of those is blooming. It's just a huge business right now. Those deserve to be discredited. But there are also, in many cases, legitimate bodies that can't get accredited because there is no accreditation scheme. Right? My company has this certification that we can't get accredited because it doesn't fit into any existing scheme. I have to create a new scheme in order for us to get accredited. And that's going to be a whole lot of work to do. We haven't ruled it out, but it's possible. There are other certifications. We see that happening with AI now. AI is so new that there's no scheme for it. So a lot of products are trying to figure out how to do this. But many cases there are, not many, but some cases there are legitimate bodies that can't get accreditation. and become part of the IAF family, but they're discredited because the IAF is putting out this flood of material, basically bad mouthing you. You're either in the scheme and paying for protection, but if you don't pay for protection, they're going to discredit you, and they're certainly not going to run to your protection when things go bad. This is nearly identical to the mafia's protection racket, except it's out in the open. It's done by guys in suits, right? It's not, and so it's entirely acceptable. So now let's ask the question, let's answer the question, is this illegal? Because it's fraud, there are plenty of types of fraud that are just simply bad and unethical, but are not actually violations of law. But let's break that down. Understand, first of all, there's two types of law, and we have to be careful about how we speak about each one. There's civil law and criminal law. And each country is different. I'm not a lawyer. I'm also not particularly an expert on this stuff. I only know a little bit about what I know, but this is basically true. There's civil law and there's criminal law. Civil law usually results in a civil law violation, for example, results in some kind of penalty, a fine, a ticket, an infraction of some sort. Maybe you're blocked, an injunction is put against you or something, but you don't go to jail. So an example of that would be traffic tickets, right? You get a traffic ticket. You run a red light, you're going to get a ticket. They're not going to haul you off to jail. If you start kicking the cop on the way out, that's a crime. Now you're going to go to jail. But there are plenty of those. Contract fraud, for example, doesn't end up in jail. If you violate a business-to-business contract, that's a civil matter and it gets paid, and the loser's going to have to pay some money and some fines and fees, etc. Deceptive advertising is another one. That's a civil kind of act that's covered by civil regulations and not a criminal act. And then you have general business-to-business fraud is all civil. Criminal, however, is where you end up in jail. And so that's things like murder and extortion and blackmail and these kind of things, including tax fraud. The problem is that sometimes these can overlap a little bit. And this is why, and again, I'm not an expert on this and lawyers could chime in with this, but you can have an overlap where a civil case suddenly becomes criminal or may overlap. For example, I could be engaged in business-to-business fraud, but if that fraud results in the death of people, I might be dragged into the criminal side of it now at that point. And again, I don't know how that works, and it's a case-by-case basis, but you can't say there's a strict line between them because they can sometimes overlap and one can be referred, civil can get referred into a criminal court, etc. But this scheme then, we have to look at it. Is it illegal under both civil and criminal? And the answer again is yes. On the civil side, what we have is widespread deceptive advertising and business-to-business fraud. We have the certification bodies, the accreditation bodies, and the IAF all insisting in their marketing that they do a thing, and they actually do the opposite. Okay? They don't enforce the 17,000 series. They actually help you violate them, and then will provide you, again, legal defensibility if you do. That's the opposite of what they're doing. So their marketing on its face is fraudulent. Second, they claim to comply with all of these rules that we talked about at the top of the video, where I said there are rules governing and directing these prohibitions against conflicts of interest. They're not supposed to own a consulting company, and yet they do. So they can't say we comply with the rule that says we don't own a consulting company and then own a consulting company. That in itself is a form of fraud and deception, which would be a civil violation. It could be, let me clarify, it could be a civil violation. Again, I'm not a lawyer, but it looks like it's a type of fraud. They're saying one thing, winning contracts on the basis of that, and then doing the opposite, which means they gained those contracts under fraud. That's on the civil side. Now, what about the criminal side? This gets a little bit weird at this point. I don't know enough about it, but I believe under the US, the RICO law, the RICO set of laws that they put in place to specifically go after mobsters, I believe that from my basic reading of it, that this would fall under RICO. You have a series of people working to conspire collectively to defraud a group of other people, or even an individual, but a whole, and in this case, entire industries all over the world. You have the IAF working with the accreditation bodies, where they're all intercolluding and members of each other's organizations, working with the certification bodies, providing this protection racket. I'm pretty confident it would fall under RICO, but I'm not an expert on that. I don't know. So I'll leave that to the lawyers. And then the other aspect is the liability of deaths, right? Routinely, the accreditation bodies get a free pass from governments during investigations. UKAS was found culpable in the Grenfell fire, but nothing happened. All right, nothing happened. ANAB has, I think, never been investigated, even though their name is attached to all sorts of terrible things like the Deepwater Horizon, Takata airbags, all sorts of problems. The same with the Germans and all the other accreditation bodies. Simply nothing happens. And the IAF has never faced any kind of subpoena, call to court, anything that I could tell. They might have been involved in a couple lawsuits over some rights or something, but they've never been investigated. Here's where I think, however, is the best angle of attack. And it has to do actually with tax law, believe it or not. The overwhelming majority of these accreditation bodies and some of the certification bodies, but definitely the accreditation bodies, are nonprofit charity organizations. In the United States, they're typically registered as 501c3, not-for-profit entities. In the UK, they're registered as chartered, I don't know what the name is, but they're essentially charities of some sort. That's true in Australia, New Zealand, and elsewhere. And that is the angle of attack. And that is where they are violating criminal law. Here's why. In order to, well, first of all, understand that obtaining tax-exempt status is a tremendous benefit. It is a huge gift. To operate a company, to have executives who pull salaries and get bonuses, etc., and not have to pay any taxes. That is a tremendous benefit that societies and governments give under the belief that they're helping support what they call a charity. So in order to get nonprofit status and tax-exempt status, an entity, an organization has to submit a request to the government and explain what they're doing and why what they're doing is a benefit to either trade or charity or helping the homeless or helping feed people, whatever, and in some way benefiting society. And that is what these organizations do. So in the case of ANAB and its parent ANSI, they submitted official documents multiple times to obtain their tax-exempt status, but then also to obtain federal government contracts, attesting and assuring, and what we call the reps and certs, their representations and certifications, that they enforce the accreditation rules per ISO 17011. They then attach their bylaws. In the UK, they call that their charter, right? So all of these organizations do something similar. They create bylaws or a charter that insist we adhere to these standards and we uphold all these standards. They submit that to a government and they're granted tax-exempt status. Then, on day 2, they do the opposite. They do the exact opposite of what they said. They don't enforce the accreditation rules, as we've seen. They rubber stamp, and then they provide protection against anybody saying, hey, these clients are not following the rules. That is the opposite of what they attested to the government in order to get tax-exempt status. That is criminal tax fraud. In the United States, that is something that you can be arrested for. And let's pause on that, and let me give you an example. Let's say that I go to the US government and say, I want to open up a soup kitchen to feed the homeless. I'm going to buy all this stuff. We're going to work for free. We're going to use volunteers, etc. Right? And I'm going to pay my own money to build a restaurant and everything, or not a restaurant, a building, and we're going to feed the homeless. And the government says that's a great thing. It's a charity. Good. You get tax-exempt status. I do that on Monday. Now on Tuesday, I have my tax-exempt status. I got my 501c3. All's cool. And I begin. I open up my building and I start buying the food and I start making the soup. And on day 2, I convert that into a commercial restaurant. I'm selling not to the homeless. I'm selling to people at a profit. Now there's no shareholders. There's nobody to distribute the profit to. I just take the profit and I put it in my pocket as the head of the nonprofit. But I'm doing the exact opposite of what I promised the government I would do. Therefore, I obtained my nonprofit status on the basis of fraud. That is a crime in the United States. And if I do that, I'm going to jail. So, if I'm going to jail for setting up this fake, this mythical thing, then that means that the people behind all these accreditation bodies would be in the same exact case, and they should be investigated and criminally prosecuted. The problem we have in the United States is the IRS is the one that would do that, and the IRS has had their budget slashed and is risking being dismantled entirely, right? So they don't have the people to do these audits. So we've reported ANAB. We've reported a number of these bodies for tax fraud, and none of them have been investigated because they simply don't have the manpower. My joke is like, I always say, if you have a document on your computer that you want to delete, you have two choices. You can move it to your recycle bin, or you could send it to the IRS, because it's the same thing. It's like throwing it away. There's nothing they're going to do. The same thing with filing anything with the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC. That is equivalent to throwing out a document. The FTC simply doesn't have the bandwidth, or the FBI, to process every complaint that people put through the internet. So nothing happens. But that is the angle. And this would be true in almost every country that has rules on the establishment of charities, tax exempt, whatever they call it. In all cases, these companies have attested to the fact that they do a certain thing, they obtain their tax exempt status, and then do the opposite, meaning that their tax exempt status has been obtained through fraud, and they need to go back and be held criminally liable, plus they need to go back and pay taxes since the day they were founded, which would essentially bankrupt them. Be a pretty bad day for them. We also have the fact that, again, in the EU, including UK, they have an actual regulation that says that these things are, that they have to happen. I believe that would fall under the civil side, though. I don't believe that would be a criminal violation. If the EU decided tomorrow that they wanted to enforce that law, which they don't, but if they wanted to enforce that law, I believe those would be just civil sanctions. You'd probably pay penalties and that sort of thing. And we've filed complaints. The interesting thing in the EU, this gets a little complicated, but there is an organization called the European Accreditation Cooperation, which they abbreviate EA. EA is the sole body that is tasked with enforcing that EU regulation, and they do not. So again, even the enforcement agency that the EU, the European Commission put in place to do this, they're involved in the corruption as well. And I'll just name some names right now. What we've done is multiple times we've filed complaints showing that accreditation bodies that fall under this EU regulation violated that regulation, and we sent that. And it's answered by one of two people. There is a woman named Cristina Dragici. She's Romanian, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. It could be Dragici. But Cristina or Martine Bloom. One of those two people. I hope I'm getting the names right. If I'm not, I'll put an overlay or a comment in there if I'm getting the names wrong. But they routinely go to those two people, and they shut the complaints down without action. And I have email and case after case and document after document where we filed a formal, mature, and sober complaint citing the rule that was violated, and one of those two women shut it down. All right? And we can't get anything past them. And some of these were pretty severe violations. So again, it would be a crime of some sort, either a criminal act or a civil act, but the regulators themselves do not enforce this. And why is that? That is because in order to get this fixed, the governments would have to take back control of accreditation away from all these private nonprofit organizations. Government departments would have to take that back, which is what they used to do in the 50s and 60s, right? They don't want to do that. And then regulators, legislators, and law enforcement would have to investigate and prosecute. That's how this gets fixed. Governments take back control of accreditation, and the regulators, legislators, and law enforcement enforce the law and prosecute and put people in jail if they have to. That's what needs to happen. Now, why is that likely to happen? And the answer, unfortunately, is no, which is going to guarantee more Grenfell fires, more Deepwater Horizon disasters, more Boeing crashes, because no one's taking any action to fix it. What would they have to do that? Or why don't they want to do that? And that's because primarily the governments now don't want to claw back responsibility that they handed off and outsourced to all these nonprofit private organizations. They don't want to do that because the government doesn't want responsibility for these things. They like being able to say, we outsourced it, we're not worried about it anymore. Second, if they did it, they're going to have to fund that. They have to have a department. And that means somebody could argue they're going to have to raise taxes. And raising taxes is absolutely taboo. You can't do it, right? So governments don't want to do that. They don't want to say, we're going to take back responsibility, because then now their head is on the chopping block, plus they have to pay for it. And they don't want either one of those. It's just easier to give it to private organizations and then ignore the fact that these private organizations are engaged in wholesale fraud that's killing people. Now, journalists, they don't want to investigate it, like I said, because it's complicated and boring. I was talking to a journalist about 3 weeks ago. I forget what outlet it was, Bloomberg or somewhere. And I explained this to him, and I told him, I said, this was the joke. I said, the reason that I can't get anybody to cover this is because it's complicated and boring. And he says, what you need is an O-ring. He goes, you need the O-ring. Now, and he meant by that was when the shuttle disaster, the shuttle blew up, it was tracked back to, you know, the fictional story or the folk story is that it was tracked back to O-rings. And if we could find that single like smoking gun, that O-ring that resulted in a shuttle blowing up, that would be the story. And I said, but I've got 120 O-rings in my database here. I have all these entries. I have Deepwater Horizon. I have Takata airbags. We have the Equifax hack. We have the PIP breast implant. All of these. And essentially what he was saying is we need something sexy, you know, like somebody needs to die. But many people are dying and we still can't. I think we're past that as a culture. I don't think we care anymore if people die. What happens in the news is just we're beyond that. It used to be we would be shocked. I think if SpaceX blows up a bunch of rockets and kills a bunch of people, I think it's just going to be, Elon, he's cool though. Look at him. He wears black t-shirts and he's hip. We're just going to let him get away with it. You know, nothing's going to happen. So that's a problem. Journalists aren't covering, and they desperately need to. There is a huge story here for a journalist or a series of journalists that could lead to actual changes in trade and protection of consumers and protection of the public. But they have to get over that hurdle of the fact that this is a complicated, boring story and figure out how to write it. And then the other thing is legislators don't understand it. It's really hard for them to understand it because it's hard for me to explain it to them. And so they don't want to pass laws, and plus they don't want to restrict private industry. And so they're hesitant to do anything about it. And then as far as the courts go in the US, I've studied all the court cases related to this, and the courts reliably rely on incorrect case law. They rely on case law related to education accreditation, which has nothing whatsoever to do with this whole thing that we're talking about. And they get away with it. The judges don't know to throw out the case law because it's off topic, it's inappropriate. Typically the defendants, when the litigants, they don't know, the defense doesn't know, or maybe it's the prosecution doesn't know that they should throw that out because it's not relevant. So they don't know. So we're building up a history of incorrect case law, which is just going to keep making the courts make the wrong decisions. And as a result, the courts have given wide deference to the accreditation bodies. They basically said, well, we did that in the accreditation world, so now over in this ISO scheme, we'll just let ANAB and these guys run wild. They can do whatever they want. We're not going to question them. That needs to get fixed. Are any of those things likely to happen? I think the only one that might happen is maybe journalists might wake up to this story and start to dig in and do their own research. They don't need to pay attention to me. Go in, it's out there. Do their own research and dig into the story. I don't think governments are going to claw back the responsibility to take this over, which is unfortunate. So I hope this video, again, will sit and percolate, and it helped you explain that, yes, I believe that these conflicts of interest are a violation of civil law and criminal law, especially under the tax codes, and that we could actually prosecute people to fix this. Whether or not that's going to happen, I doubt it. But let this video sit here and percolate, and perhaps over time, it will gain some steam and get in front of the right people who can make these changes, and will literally save lives in the process while we're undo this whole fraudulent scheme that has infected the entire planet. Thanks. I know this was a long video. I'm sorry, but I think you'll agree it was important. Thanks a lot.